welcome back this evening. Take a slow breath in and an even slower one out. Let the air settle in your chest and feel the weight of the day slide a little farther away. Tonight, we'll follow a narrow trail that drifts downward through quiet stone, where the world beneath the world keeps its own slow rhythm. This is the cavern beneath the quiet earth, a place carved by water, shaped by time, and lit only by the faint glow of moss and the thin light that finds its way through cracks in the ceiling above. You don't need to do anything now, just listen, breathe, and let the path open in front of you. When you're ready, we can start the descent together. The entrance to the cavern sat halfway down a slope of limestone and grass, half hidden behind a curtain of vines. I only noticed it when the wind shifted and drew the leaves aside, showing a dark space beyond that looked more like a pause than an opening. The air that drifted out was cool and damp, carrying a scent of stone and something faintly green. Not sharp or earthy, just old in a clean kind of way, like water that's been resting for centuries. I hesitated a moment, then stepped closer, brushing the vines aside with my hand. The daylight dimmed with each step until the world narrowed to the soft sound of my shoes on rock and the quiet drip of water deeper inside. After a few breaths, my eyes began to adjust. The walls glowed faintly with thin patches of moss, the kind that gives off its own pale light when it thinks no one's watching. The glow wasn't bright enough to see far, but it was enough to show me the gentle curve of the passage leading down. I followed the tunnel as it wound lower, each step echoing softly off the damp floor. The walls were smooth in places and rough in others, like the rock hadn't decided which way it wanted to be. Here and there, tiny streams of water ran in thin threads along the stone, leaving faint trails of silver where they caught the moss light. Every sound I made came back to me a little slower than it left, stretched thin by distance and curve. It gave the impression that the cavern was thinking about each noise before returning it. The air grew cooler, but not cold, just settled, like a room that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. I reached out once to steady myself on the wall and felt the surface pulse faintly with drops of moisture, each one trembling before letting go. The drip landed somewhere unseen, and the echo rolled away in slow, soft ripples. After a while, the passage opened into a chamber that seemed to breathe on its own. The ceiling rose high enough that the light from the moss only reached partway up before it gave up and faded into shadow. Far above, thin cracks split the rock, and through them slipped narrow threads of sunlight, not bright, more like golden dust that had forgotten what to do with itself. Where the beams touched the floor, the moss brightened, as if encouraged. I walked toward one of those patches and crouched beside it. Tiny droplets clung to the leaves, each one reflecting both the moss light and the daylight in the same small sparkle. It looked like the cave had invented its own stars to keep it company. There was a shallow pool in the center of the chamber. Its surface was so still that it seemed to be holding its breath. When I leaned closer, I saw faint rings of color shift just beneath the water, greens, blues, and pale gold, like light moving through layers of glass. A single droplet fell from the ceiling and touched down with barely a sound, sending a slow ripple across the pool. The reflection of the moss lights bent and wavered, making it look as though the cavern itself was exhaling. I stayed there for a while, listening. Every sound was soft enough to seem deliberate. The quiet drip of water, the small rustle of something shifting deeper inside, the almost imperceptible hum of air moving through unseen cracks. It wasn't silence. Not exactly. It was presence. The kind that fills space without needing to say anything. When I finally stood again, I noticed another passage leading out of the chamber, narrower and darker than the one I had entered through. Its entrance was framed by a fringe of moss, glowing faintly like a soft invitation. I hesitated only long enough to take one last look at the pool, then stepped toward the new tunnel and let the light from behind fade slowly off my shoulders. The ground sloped gently downward once more, and the sound of dripping water followed me like a guide. The deeper I went, the steadier my breathing became, as if the cavern itself was keeping time for me. Whatever waited ahead didn't feel hidden or secret. It just felt quiet. And I continued on. The tunnel narrowed as I went on, the walls closing in just enough that I had to walk with one shoulder turned. The rock here was smoother, almost polished by the steady touch of water over years that I couldn't begin to count. Every few steps, I could hear the faint whisper of air moving through cracks, the way a building sighs at night when everything has gone still. The glow of the moss dimmed and then returned in patches, as if it grew in places the light above never reached. I brushed my hand along the wall and felt a pulse of cool dampness. Tiny droplets clung to the skin of my fingers, and for a moment, I could smell something sharp and clean, like rain that hadn't fallen in years. The floor sloped more steeply now, and I slowed my pace, listening to the echo of my steps fade farther behind me. The sound didn't disappear. It just went somewhere deeper, as though the cavern had more room for echoes than I could ever fill. After a few minutes, the tunnel widened again into another chamber, smaller than the first but filled with a soft, pale light that seemed to come from nowhere in particular. The walls shimmered faintly with veins of crystal running through the stone, catching the faintest glow from the moss and reflecting it back in gentle color. A thin waterfall slipped through a crack high above and traced a line down one wall before collecting in a small pool at my feet. The water was so clear that I could see smooth stones beneath its surface, each one patterned with faint swirls that looked almost like writing. When I reached down and brushed one with my fingertips, the markings caught the light and shimmered for a heartbeat, then went still again. I stood there a while, watching the small ripples fade and return as the sound of falling water filled the space with a calm, steady rhythm. I followed the edge of the pool until the path curved into another passage, this one lit by a thin ribbon of daylight spilling through a long fracture in the ceiling. The beam stretched across the rock in a perfect straight line, cutting the space in two, one side glowing, the other resting in shadow. Dust drifted slowly through the light, turning as it fell like tiny pieces of ash suspended in water. I stepped through it carefully, not wanting to disturb the line, but the dust seemed to move aside on its own, floating just far enough to let me pass. The warmth from the sunlight touched the back of my hand, faint but steady, and for a few seconds the cool, damp smell of the cave gave way to something softer, dry air maybe, or the scent of grass waiting above. Then it was gone, and the stone closed over the beam behind me. As I went deeper, the walls began to sparkle more often, and the sound of dripping water changed to something lower, Not quite a hum, but a resonance that seemed to come from the stone itself. It was so faint that I might have imagined it, though it followed the rhythm of my steps in a way that felt intentional. I stopped once to listen more closely and realized it wasn't one sound at all, but many. Hundreds of tiny echoes woven together into a single note. It vibrated against my ribs like a low breath, never loud enough to startle, just there to remind me I wasn't the first to hear it. I leaned lightly against the wall and let my hand rest flat against it. The surface was smooth and cold, but underneath it was that same slow thrum, like the earth itself was remembering to breathe. The more I listened, the more natural it seemed, like finding a rhythm that had always been there, but forgotten. Ahead, a faint shimmer on the ceiling caught my attention. When I raised my eyes, I saw thousands of droplets clinging to the rock, glowing faintly where the moss light touched them. They looked like stars suspended upside down, frozen in the act of falling. As I walked beneath them, the soft vibration in the walls seemed to shift, harmonizing faintly with the sound of my steps. The air grew cooler again, but I hardly noticed. It felt as though the cavern and I were learning how to move at the same pace. And when the last of the glowing droplets disappeared behind me, I kept walking forward, deeper into the quiet earth. The next chamber widened with each step until the floor leveled into a broad space glowing with a pale green light. At first, I thought it was moss along the walls, but the glow came from beneath the water. A wide underground lake filled most of the room, clear enough to see smooth stone shelves descending into it, layer after layer, like the ribs of the earth. Light rippled across the surface, moving slowly as though the lake were breathing. I crouched near the edge and let my hands rest on the cool rock. The air smelled faintly sweet, the kind of scent that lives in water untouched for years. A drop fell from the ceiling and landed with a soft plink, sending wide rings across the surface. Each ripple caught the glow, scattering it across the ceiling like trembling stars. A thin walkway of stone curved along one side of the lake. It was barely wide enough to cross, so I kept a hand to the wall. The light pulsed faintly every few breaths, shifting like it was following me. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until even the dripping stopped. Only a low hum remained, not sound exactly, more a vibration that drifted through the air. It pulsed through my fingers and shoes, steady and calm, like the cavern's own heartbeat. Ancient, but gentle. It seemed to welcome me rather than warn me away. At the far end of the walkway, a second lake glowed brighter than the first. Sunlight filtered through cracks high above, scattering across the water in golden shards. The beams caught in drifting mist, turning it into soft columns that reached toward the ceiling. I stood where the two lights met, one from the moss, one from the sun, and watched them blend, green and gold rippling across the stone. A few pale fish moved lazily below, leaving thin trails of light that vanished behind them. I couldn't tell if they were glowing or if the light simply followed them. Either way, it was peaceful, motion made only to fill the silence. I sat near the edge, feet above the water. The air was cool enough to lift goosebumps along my arms, but soft enough to stay. I could hear faint movement below, the brush of water against stone, and somewhere deeper, the slow fall of droplets. Time felt blurred, as if the air itself had forgotten how to keep count. When I exhaled, the surface rippled, carrying my reflection outward until it dissolved. For a moment, the shapes in the water looked doubled, like another figure sitting beside me, then settled back into one. A narrow passage at the far side climbed upward, walls streaked with veins of color catching both moss and sun. It felt like walking through a prism made of stone. The light shifted along the walls as I moved, slow and steady. Every few steps, the hum from below rose faintly, then eased again. Not fading, just resting. At the top, I heard the quiet trickle of water nearby and followed it through a bend in the tunnel. Everything here asked to be moved through slowly. The passage opened into a smaller space lit by one shaft of sunlight. It struck a smooth column of rock in the center, polished to a mirror-like sheen. The light bounced upward, scattering faint shapes across the ceiling, soft patterns like water seen from below. They drifted and changed until the beam dimmed, the sun outside shifting past. The cavern's glow softened, and the shadows leaned in again. Not closing, just resting. And I rested with it. The slope leading out of the round chamber was narrow, the rock smooth and damp beneath my hand. The faint hum from the lakes below still pressed softly through the walls, growing lighter as I climbed. Warm air brushed past my face in quiet waves, carrying the scent of earth and faint traces of sunlight. The air thinned with every step, as though the cave itself was preparing to hand me back to the surface. The moss light followed for a while, then faded until only pale reflections remained. The sound of trickling water guided me upward, slow and steady, matching my breath. The cave seemed to breathe with me, calm and patient. I walked until the rhythm of my steps felt like part of the place itself. The tunnel widened into a gallery where crystals no bigger than grains of sand glimmered in the walls. They caught bits of light from above and scattered them in slow-moving ripples. It was like walking through a dim field of stars, each one shifting just enough to remind me it was alive. A soft chime came when my sleeve brushed the wall, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. I stopped to listen, but the sound faded, replaced by the echo of my breath returning from ahead. That's when I saw it, a circle of pale light spilling through a rough break in the ceiling. It painted the floor in gold, bright enough for small plants to grow at its edges, thin stems with tiny leaves reaching upward. It felt strange to find something living so deep underground, but also right, as if the light had called them here. I stepped closer and felt the warmth on my neck. A soft draft drifted down, carrying the scent of open air and faint grass. Somewhere far above, I thought I heard wind. The sound made me smile. After so long in stillness, motion itself felt like a gift. I looked up through the shaft, squinting at the light. The opening wasn't large, but through it I could see a patch of pale blue sky scattered with thin clouds. The sunlight wavered as leaves above moved in the wind, sending ripples of gold and shadow across the floor. I found a low rock nearby and sat. The stone was cool, but the light across my hands was warm enough to balance it. I traced the edge of the light with my fingers, following it into shade. It was strange how quickly the outside world could return, not with noise, but with color. That soft gold, that faint blue, they felt like memories resurfacing. Maybe that was the cave's secret, holding quiet until someone remembered to listen. I sat there until the light began to fade, stretching my legs toward the last bright patch before it dimmed. When I finally stood, a narrow path climbed upward through a tangle of thin roots hanging from the ceiling. They were pale and damp, twitching slightly in the draft like strands of hair in water. I brushed one with my hand, cool, alive. Beyond them, the tunnel slanted higher, the air growing fresher. The hum from below faded completely, replaced by the soft hiss of wind through unseen cracks. It carried hints of sound from the surface, distant and blurred, but real. Birds maybe, or leaves moving in light. I followed that sound the way someone follows a scent, and behind me, the darkness settled, content to rest again. I kept walking toward the sound. The tunnel angled upward for a long while before the slope began to ease. The air grew lighter, touched with the scent of soil and grass after rain. Each step warmed the stone beneath my feet until a wide, soft light appeared ahead. Not a narrow beam or a crack, but open light, the kind that spills and stays. The path flattened into a hollow framed by twisting roots, their shapes like the ribs of the earth itself. Through them, I saw the gentle brightness of afternoon. A cool breath of air drifted down, carrying faint sounds of life above. After so long in stillness, even that small noise felt new. I climbed the last stretch on hands and knees, stone crumbling softly beneath my palms. When I emerged, sunlight filled everything. The world above seemed impossibly bright, as though it had been waiting to remind me what color looked like. The sky spread wide and pale, and grass bent gently in the wind, whispering across the hill. The air shimmered faintly, and for a second I imagined the cavern breathing behind me, sending one last exhale of coolness to follow me into the light. I turned to see the dark circle of the cave, a quiet mouth in the hillside, its edges ringed with moss that glimmered like memory. It seemed to settle as I watched, folding itself back into rest. I stood there breathing the two airs together, the cool of the cavern, the warmth of the day, balanced in between. The field stretched outward, a slow wave of grass that caught the sunlight in small glittering flecks. I started walking, letting my hand drift across the tips as I passed. They tickled my palm, soft and familiar, each movement whispering like water over stone. I could still feel the faint pulse of the cave deep in the soles of my feet, steady and low, a reminder of what waited beneath. A few wildflowers nodded beside the path, thin stems, faded blues and yellows that seemed to hold the last trace of summer. Above, a cloud passed over the sun, dimming the world for a heartbeat before light returned. It made me think of the way shadows had moved across the water below, slow and unhurried. The same rhythm seemed to follow me here, stitched into the air itself. When I reached the rise of the hill, the land opened wide. Far off, a narrow stream wound through the valley, silver and thin like a thread of light. I could hear it faintly, the sound mingling with the wind's soft hum. Everywhere I looked, the horizon shimmered, not from heat, but from the way the grass swayed, catching sun in endless motion. For a moment, I wondered if this was how the cavern saw the world, slow, glowing, shifting, but never in a hurry. The thought stayed with me as I stood there, the memory of light moving beneath stone now mirrored above it. The quiet below and the quiet above were not opposites, only reflections of the same calm seen from different sides. I lingered a while longer, letting the air cool against my face. It didn't feel like leaving, more like the cavern had carried me as far as it meant to, and now it could rest. The hum was gone, but its rhythm stayed somewhere inside me, steady and low. I turned toward the light and let it warm my face. Then I kept walking, following the trail wherever it chose to lead next. The sound of my footsteps faded into the breeze, and the hillside behind me grew still once more, just as it had been before. So here is where the story ends. As you lie there, somewhere between waking and sleep, maybe the quiet of the cavern lingers a little longer. The cool air, the faint glow, the steady hum beneath the earth. Let it stay with you for a while. Let it remind you that calm doesn't disappear. It only changes places. And as you drift, know that the world beneath the world keeps breathing, slow and patient, waiting for whoever might wander through next. Good night, and rest easy.